Hi, folks. Sorry I couldn't be there today. Feeling a bit under the weather. Um, Heads up on what's going on for the next. Let me turn on the light here. It's like horror lighting, a little tight. Okay, and that doesn't look much better. But anyway, um, midterm is this Friday as scheduled. I'll be there. You'll just need a pencil and a Scantron. You'll not need a blue book because I'll give you a copy of the exam to write your essay on, or an extra piece of paper rather. You'll wait outside before class. We'll put out the exams. We'll start seating at just before 11 o'clock, and you'll have about 45 minutes for the exam. So that's 20 multiple choice questions. A minute a question puts you at 20 minutes, and that still gives you 25 minutes for a pretty short, pretty straightforward essay. And then I'll need both copies of the exam signed, and there's 2 pages in the exam. I want both of them back, and then I'll also need your Scantron. And that's it. And then on Wednesday, we're going to have a guest speaker, Carson Jeffries, who's going to talk about his work in the Amazon using fish eye lenses and to determine their habitat usage with stable isotopes. So that's the plan for this week. And then on Friday, we have the Putah Creek field trip. I think about 55 or so of you are going. If you have not expressly signed up or been invited or given permission, please don't come. There's just a lot of people as it is, and the creek is swift, and we don't need more people to worry about there. So even though it's accessible, I'm really asking extras to not show up just because it's more responsibility for us. So let's see. There's no way. Oh yeah, there is. Let me turn on my laser pointer. So I was wrapping up with the early actinopterygians, and we got to the non-neopterygian uh, actinopterygians. These are the chondrostii, which are include the sturgeons and the paddlefish. Interesting because they, after having ossified ancestors, lost their ossification and then re-evolved a cartilaginous skeleton, probably to accommodate their sort of large body size, but it's not at all clear. I spoke pretty much pretty clearly about sturgeon, so I'll just fly through it. You know, they're basic. They have actinopterygian-like characteristics, in particular the ray fins, external fertilization with egg laying. They've got gills. They don't have lungs. They do have a physostomous swim bladder for operating at depth without having to gulp water from the surface. They don't really have scales. They have scutes, and then they have a heterocercal tail. Um, so still ancestral in many ways, but they do have the basic fundamental sort of actinopterygian flavor to them. There's about four genera. They're only found in the northern hemisphere. There's 5 rows of scutes around the body, which is strange. 5 is just a funny number for a symmetrical for a bilaterally symmetrical organism. Um, and they can be found in both freshwater and marine systems because they're anatomous. They go out to sea and come back up to spawn. They inhabit lakes, large rivers, and coastal areas. They feed on stuff on the bottom, and they have like an inordinate amount of chromosomes, um, which is probably because they're so ancient and having a complex genetic reserve has allowed them to evolve and respond to conditions, but it is unusual and I can't really explain it why. They get quite large. Caviar is their downfall because people, for some reason, like to eat it. It's the eggs. Um, the beluga sturgeon is critically um, threatened. Um, according to the IUCN and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, has banned it under the Endangered Species Act. It was one of the first species not within the territorial boundaries of the U.S. to ever be put on the endangered species list. And so as a result, you can't get beluga caviar here in the US. But there are people here who have tried to study sturgeon and have tried to compensate for the lack of beluga sturgeon by creating a cultured sturgeon that can produce eggs here in the US. And UC Davis has been in the forefront of that. One of the scientists who's involved in studying the high number of chromosomes and their plasticity of these organisms is Andrea Schreier, who's an adjunct full professor now over at she's the director of the Genomic Variation Lab over in Animal Science. If you're interested in sturgeon or interested in fish, she's a great person to contact. She's really fun and fun to work for. Also in the same group of the Chondrosteae and the Accipensiformes is the family Polydontidae, which are the paddlefishes. There's a couple of genera of paddlefishes, and there's two species. There's one species that's native to the Mississippi Basin, and the other to the Yangtze Basin, that's the Chinese paddlefish, and it's thought to be extinct. So they're very similar to the sturgeon. Have retained a heterocercal tail. They have cartilaginous skeleton. They're part of the chondrosteae. Um, and they have eggs with external fertilization. These guys don't have bony plates. They just have a few sort of small scales. And they have this large, bony rostral paddle. And they're planktivorous rather than benthic feeders. Inside the mouth, you can see the gill rakers are densely packed, which are designed for filter feeding. And I thought I had a video. Oh yeah, here you can see, sorry, a little out of order, but here you can see a paddlefish opening its mouth wide. They'll open their mouth while they're cruising, and then water moves in through the mouth, runs across the gill rakers, and zooplankton are captured on the filaments around the gill rankers. This is the American paddlefish, and it's confined to the Mississippi Basin, and it's somewhat vulnerable um, in terms of its status. Let me go back a little bit and talk about these rostral paddles. The paddles are just packed with these ampullae, and they're even richer on the juveniles for some reason. And these ampullae can determine weak electrical currents that are developed by by really small organisms like water fleas, like Daphnia or zooplankton or any kind of drift in the water that they feed on. Let's see. I think this is the American paddlefish, and this is a picture of the underside of the rostrum of a Chinese paddlefish, and you can see the clusters of ampullae even more clearly in this one. So, threats to paddlefish. It's not about the caviar. It really has to do with habitat disruption and lack of connectivity. So they can live pretty long. Um, they can attain very long lengths, up to, over 6 feet. Um, but their main issues are loss of spawning habitat, like fast flowing water with clean gravel bottoms. And these spawning areas get degraded by agriculture, they get degraded by levee work, they get degraded by roads, all of which dump sediment into streams and degrade the quality of clean gravel at the bottom. And dams in particular lead to backup reservoirs and regions that interfere with their ability to transit the river from sort of foraging grounds to improved waters that support spawning. Um, so as a result, they they have suffered in both the US as well as China. And there's a recreational fishery for them, at least historically. Um, And the Chinese paddlefish was ancient and rarer than the Mississippi is right now, even when they were both around. Just This is a video on patio fish if you want to see them doing their thing. Here's a picture of an old picture of a Chinese paddlefish. It's not terribly old. It's probably a couple decades old. The issue with the Chinese paddlefish, the main issue with the Chinese paddlefish was the construction of dams. So they had a pretty limited range, a number of rivers um, throughout, all emptying into the China Sea here. And here the main ones are labeled. There was a really large dams that were put on the Yellow River and the Yangtze River that disrupted movement. This was in the early 2000s, and by the late 2000s, they were pretty much on the way out. Um, and I think that there might be a program. I know that when I was studying ecology at UC Davis as a grad student, there was a Chinese student who was very much interested in the conservation of these fishes. They weren't completely winked out yet. And so she was interested in it. And I don't know if it's really related to her work or not, but there's some effort to sort of reconstitute them genetically or to at least preserve them in hatcheries, which is mostly fallen apart because they have gone extinct. But there might be some limited hatcheries. It's a little bit late. It's kind of an old story. Once you build these disruptions and the species winks out and goes extinct, it's really hard to restore them at all. And then what do you restore them to? But I think there might be a genetic effort to reconstitute them, and that's a thing now, not just with mammoths or other other ancient animals that are being revived. So anyway, I think paddlefish are subject to this process as well. I doubt it will be successful, but there are people tinkering with it in China. And this is the problem. Here's the three, or one of the problems. There are several of these problems. They're all the same. They're giant dams. The Three Gorges Dam is the largest dam in the world in terms of its electrical capacity. And so, yeah, the fishes were declared in 2022. And China took a lot of heat for this, but what were China's priorities at the time? They were to to power a global economy, to raise their population out of poverty and turn it into a global economic powerhouse. And it did all those things. And often that's the kind of driving ambition that drives a lot of species extinct. And of course, in the US, we went through the same process in the 1940s through the 1970s was our big era of dam building. And so, and species went extinct as a result of that. So they're just kind of mimicking our progress. So, and this is a pattern as nations industrialize, their priorities shift to money and power. And so the Three Gorges Dam and the extinction of the paddlefish is consistent with that. Um, Want to get into the Neopterygians now. These are all bony, ancient, or I should say bony, more ancient actinopterygian or ray fin fishes. The Lepizosteiformes include the gars. Um, and in the gar, there's one family, there's two genera, seven species. They appeared 200, 150 million years ago. They have bony skeletons now, so this whole cartilaginous thing is pretty much out of the picture. Um, they lack lungs, but they have a highly vascularized swim bladder that can double as a lung. So they can facultatively, they don't have to do this, but they can facultatively gulp air and hold it in their swim bladder in order to breathe. And this is very useful for the sort of slow-moving, swampy, low oxygen conditions that they find in the southeast US, which is where they live. They have ganoid scales, which you can see in the photo here, these plaque-like bony scales that sort of lock in with each other. They still have the heterocercal tail, and they have eggs with external fertilization, and they're almost exclusively found in North America. Oh, looks like my slide sort of just freaked out over here. And this looks like it has the same information, but more poorly laid out than my previous slide. So, uh, with the exception of their distribution, which has disappeared, but it also shows their status here. They're not particularly threatened at this time. Interesting note that some of the native tribes, particularly the Choctaw and I believe the Creek, that live at the southern end of the Gar distribution, have this dance. The dance is basically a circle dance, and they rotate in a cul- they rotate in a counterclockwise direction, which apparently the Gar rotate in a counterclockwise direction as well. And it's said that the Gar understand that that's the same rotation of the planet. And so there's sort of the sacredness about the Gar in these indigenous groups in the U.S. And like many other fishes, they're a symbol of birth and renewal and rebirth. And so that process of spawning and then regeneration and the circling of the earth is said to be linked together as this sort of fertility dance. Um, and then the final Neopterygian group that we'll talk about are the Ameiformes. They're kind of an oddball species. There's just one of them, the bowfin. The bowfin is also found in the southeast U.S., along the southern end of the Mississippi drainage and along the eastern seaboard. Um, they are not in any kind of, they're not vulnerable at all, although I've never seen a bowfin because haven't spent enough time down there, but apparently they're quite common. And they have these near teleostean features, teleostean being the more derived of the Actinopterygii. They have the bony skeleton. They have a maxilla that's hinged towards the rostrum here. And you can see it in this nice picture here. You can see where the maxilla folds right in to the side of the skull here. So when the mouth closes, that folds back in here, and when it opens, it swings forward, which helps in suction feeding and gives the mouth a larger gape. They still lack the premaxilla, which is that additional bone that slides the whole thing forward. Like the more evolved um, rayfin fishes, they have cycloid scales. So we've moved past these sort of hard, heavy ganoid scales. They have an almost homocircle tail. They have a symmetrical shaped heterocircle tail. It's sort of a false heterocircle, and then it has the vertebrae goes up over into the upper lobe, but not very far, and it has a bunch of rays that make it appear to be somewhat homocircle or symmetrical. They still retain the very vascularized physostomatic swim bladder for both facultative air breathing as well as regulation of buoyancy. And they're just, it's the same kind of habitat that say that gars live in. It's like these slow-moving, low oxygen waters. And they have a rather bony head. So they have these plates, and on the bottom is this gular plate. I don't know why they have it, but it's there and it's unique to this species. Other fishes don't have it. And these guys are piscivorous predators. So they lie in wait and then pounce with that big gape and that large thrusting tail and capture their prey. So we're gonna segue now um, to the modern fishes or the teleostean fishes, which people think of them as being the modern fishes, but let's just note again that the elasmobranchs, the sharks and rays, these ancestral actinopterygians that we've just talked about for the past couple of days, and the teleost. They all evolved somewhere out of the Devonian, and they all radiated into different new niches during the Cenozoic. So quite recently, these groups have all sort of radiated. And the exception are the Sarcopterygians, which are the sort of, these sort of living fossils that have really retained their body form, but over hundreds of millions of years. But the species, the Neopterygi, well, the Neopterygians, the bony fishes, and the sharks especially have evolved into new niches. Um, and that's what we'll continue to talk about what those patterns look like. And just so you know, this is what, I don't know if my face is in the way here, so I'm gonna take a second to move my face out of the way of the chart, at least for me. So this is the chart. We've made some progress down. We started with the agnathans, moved down through the gnathostomata, the jawed fishes, which include the Sarcopterygian, and their sister group, the Actinopterygian. And we just talked about these four groups here: the Cladistia, the Bashirs, the Chondrostii, which include the paddlefish and the sturgeon, and then the Neopterygians, the gars and the bowfin. And now the sister group to those is the Teleosteans. Um, and that's what I'm going to spend the next little bit of time talking about in class. Um, Note, though, just to keep it all in your brain, that the teleos are really kind of, I said they were a sister group. I'm actually going to walk that back a little bit because they're probably not really a sister group. They're probably a subgroup, even though in my chart, they're listed sort of on the same parallel here, just like, so for example, like the gnathostomes and the agnathostomes are listed at the superclass level, the sarcops and the actinops are listed at the class level. We're really, and this is where things start to fall apart because of the intense diversity of fishes and the controversy around their classification. The teleosteans are really kind of a subgroup of these neopterygians. And the Neopterygians are probably a sister group to the Chondrosteans, and they all exist within the Actinopterygians. So we really have something like you've got the Actinopterygia, the Cladistia are their own weird thing over here, and then you've got the Chondrostia and the Neopterygians, and then nested under Neopterygians are the Teleosteans, and then later the Acanthopterygians, which are nested under the Teleos. Got it? Good. And as I said before, the Sarcopterygian and the Actinopterygians, they're sister groups within a group that I haven't even explicitly laid out, which would exist probably right in here, which are the Osteichthyans. And the Osteichthyans is the sister group of the Chondrichthyans, right? And they're if I were to include all these sorts of caveats and details, the tree gets so complicated that it's hard to follow. And so, just for the purposes of being easily able to identify and talk about the groups, I've left some of these nuances out. And I appreciate the fact that it's complicated. But I just want you to know that there are nuances here that I'm not really holding you to the fire to understanding. So, so the Osteichthyans, the unnamed Osteichthyans include all of these guys down here, right? Including the Sarcopterygian and the Actinopterygian. And that's the sister group here to the Chondrichthyes. And then, of course, as everybody knows, the Gnathostomes are the sister group to the Agnathostomes. And I hope that's percolating into your brain in some fashion that helps you organize all this material. So, but back to the present, like what's really going on? Let's talk a little bit about wreckage and restoration. I talked about the Chinese paddlefish and how the main problem was connectivity, the loss of connectivity of its habitat, so that it was unable to reach spawning grounds. And of course, the main solution for an issue like that is to remove the dam or build fish ladders. But China was not able to do that. When you have a giant dam, it's very difficult to construct some kind of passage And China wasn't able to do that in time, or really, realistically, they weren't willing or able to make the sacrifices and the compromises necessary to maintain the paddlefish and some other species as well. And so that species has mostly gone extinct. Um, I talked a little bit, I alluded to the fact that in some places, like in the Bahamas, um, there was this project to restore nursery habitat. And I think I mentioned at the time that sharks tend to reproduce, either giving live birth or laying their egg cases in shallow, warm water, presumably because the water is warm in these shallow areas. And that helps with gestation. It helps with the early juveniles in terms of their development. And these sorts of nursery areas are these backwater areas that provide and concentrate a lot of resources for young sharks. And they're probably less vulnerable to predation. It's just the nature of a bay or an estuary. So mortality is lower when they're small and vulnerable. And so these sorts of habitats are super critical to help maintain sharks, and they're also extremely vulnerable because people do things like build roads on them to get around. So in the Bahamas, the issue was not like a giant dam to hold fresh water. Really, it was just passage. And when they built these things, they just dumped a bunch of soil or material or blocks into the lagoon here, and that just cut it off from the sea. So they couldn't get back up into these little estuaries here. So somebody started studying this, and they're like, "Well, that's an easy fix." And so they basically dug them out and they hacked open some of the pathways on either side of this to facilitate water returning to the landscape. And then they dumped some really, or they constructed and laid in with concrete, sand, and rubble. These really simple culverts, like really, like it's pretty primitive, but it was just enough to allow passage through. Either they were large enough to allow some of the adults to access it and use those, or large enough for the juveniles to use these backwater habitats. And the cool thing about it is lots of other fish use those habitats as well. This is a mangrove forest here. This is a mangrove tree, and the mangroves just they create a lot of structure, so you get a lot of um, uh, essentially epiphytic. It's not the right word, but oh, sorry, I'm sick. You get a lot of organisms living on the surface of the roots and the shoots of the mangroves, and that creates a food source for fishes it creates this structure that allows the bottom of the food web to sort of develop, in addition to there being just sort of this pool of water with a lot of zooplankton in it. Um, and that was a very successful project. That was kind of a homegrown thing by the Bahamas Conservation.org. And there were some people from Florida who were studying that. I didn't include the paper, but the work has been well documented. Successful restoration, super cool. And then Rachel Johnson was here, last week, and I have to move my face out of the way again. She was talking about the decline in salmon uh, over the long term. And this is a function of the same issue that hit the Chinese paddlefish. It was basically dam construction, but dam construction really even came after earlier processes that occurred in the California landscape. Most of the rivers in California dump into the Central Valley, which is this really fertile floodplain. And so, as early as the 18 mid 19th century, 1860s through 1900, by 1900, like most of California's rivers had been heavily diverted for agriculture, particularly in the San Joaquin Valley. And the San Joaquin Valley was really important. The San Joaquin River was a really important run for spring run salmon, which we'll study this more, but spring run would come up in the spring up into the main rivers. They would hold in the summer in these pools at the bottom end, at the bottom end of the high altitude part of the rivers, like the Merced or the Tuolumne or the Stanislaus. And then when the fall rains came, they would start to move up into the high altitude and they'd lay their eggs up there, which would overwinter and then come back the next year or the year after. After the water diversions occurred, the San Joaquin River started running dry, and you can see as early as the like 1920s, 1930s, that whole fishery had mostly collapsed. Today, we only have a few species left. They're super, super vulnerable. A few individuals left. They're super, super vulnerable. So this was actually before the era of big dam building. And also the spring run formed the dominant run of salmon in the San Francisco Bay. There were more hatcheries on the San Francisco Bay estuary than anywhere else in the world at the time, and it was mostly the springers. Today, it's the main fishery is the fall run. Why the fall run? Because the fall, as you may remember from Rachel, the fall run were well adapted to low elevation rivers, flat, broad, warmer rivers. Rachel, that was mostly interested in, she mostly studies winter run, which has a similar life history in that they try to get up to those high altitude rivers by the McCloud River and the Pitt River, which were blocked off by the Shasta Reservoir. And the Shasta was built in the 1940s, and you can see they were still hanging on. There was a decline, it's off the picture here, but they were hanging off, and then they really suffered during droughts when the amount of water became really limited and temperatures were poorly regulated. And then in the 2000s, they were managers were trying to deal with them and kind of um, there was the implementation of this temperature control device on the Shasta Reservoir to release mostly cold water, help the population a little bit, but they're really tanking. This just goes to 2014, and it's actually kind of bottomed out since then. So that was a lot on salmon. But the point being that it was this is the historic, this is from Rachel's slide, this is the historic distribution of available rivers and the spawning habitat of salmon in the California Central Valley. You can see the springers are all up here, mostly using the San Joaquin Valley, that is the southern Central Valley rivers. And the winter run came up here and used this high elevation habitat almost all the way up into Oregon, actually. Um, and then today, it's all truncated by the many, many dams. Almost every river in California is dammed. And so the fishes are sort of compressed in the low elevation range of the rivers, and they're mostly been um, prevented from going up into the historic habitat upstream. So, but there's solutions. Like the Chinese paddlefish and the Three Gorges Dam, it's nobody wants to tear down a dam that is essentially the centerpiece of a massive economy. A lot of people rely on it, and are governments really going to be motivated to preserve things for the sake of preserving things? No, there's too many people whose livelihoods depend upon it. Governments and civilizations don't really tend to invest in ideas or art or beautiful concepts like diversity unless there's some kind of economic benefit. There's too many other countervailing pressures. However, there are good people out there who do their best. And the Endangered Species Act, an amazingly progressive piece of legislation that was passed in the 1972, does allow for some interventions to occur. It holds these dam operators to some kind of a standard in protecting species, and sometimes these measures fail. I'll talk about the failures in another talk, but I want to talk about a success or maybe a moderate success. This is Rachel with somebody uh, looking at an in-dam collection system. So, and here's the actual collector here. Trucking salmon up and around the dam and letting them go on the McCloud, letting them reproduce naturally, facilitated by a kind of natural system of hatchery that she and the tribes developed, or that many people developed with the tribes, and then collecting the babies when they come down and then trucking them back down has actually helped limp the winter run along. So, case of human intervention that's had limited effects, but as we've seen with other rivers in California, dams do come down and times change. The question for people who love winter run salmon is, can you keep them alive long enough to outlast the dams? And they might. But I want to talk with the rest of the time about Putah Creek, which is another example of a really pretty significant and pretty successful restoration. And like most other restorations, like a culvert through under a road, you haven't really changed the road, but you have provided access. So it's a reconciliation move. It's like not pure restoration. It's a reconciliation with the reality that people want to get around. And the winter run salmon, like and hatchery use in general, it's a reconciliation process where trucking salmon around the dam is may not be the ultimate solution, but it's enough to limp you along. And in Putah Creek, it's not the historic creek that it was back in the 1800s when when white people first described it. And you can see some of the descriptions of some of the early scientists who walked up Putah Creek in the fish lab if you look on the back wall. They're kind of interesting. They describe a very different system, a kind of low-lying river that spilled its banks and would put Davisville, the old town of Davis, underwater on a regular occasion. Um, and and so I guess the key thing is that that river sort of existed much more on the surface of the landscape, whereas the Putah Creek that you'll see this weekend, or maybe you've seen already, is like about 50 feet below the edge of the landscape, and it's still surrounded by levees and whatnot. But folks have taken action to try to revive it, and they've been quite successful. It's quite a beautiful place. So this is the Putah Creek watershed here on the right. Here's here's us in Davis. Putah Creek dumps out somewhere on the edge of the Yolo bypass, which is that big causeway of water that you cross when you're driving to Sacramento. It floods up in the wintertime and it's used mostly for rice crops in the summer. And then eventually, if it's running and it's connected, which it's not always connected, it flows out into the Sacramento River and out into the Delta and out into the ocean. And the creek itself runs up past Winters, up past Cold Creek, which is a UC reserve that's open to the public. And into past the giant dam here at Lake Berryessa, and then it actually runs up above the lake and all the way into Lake County up here. So it's actually it's pretty a large watershed, and Lake Berryessa is a really, really rich source of water that's mostly used not by us in Yolo County, but mostly supplies Solano County, that includes Vacaville and Fairfield to the west of us with water source for agriculture, and it really contributes to the sort of wealth of that county. Um, this is just a close-up of the stretch that we're on and where we'll be going. We're here in Davis, and we're gonna come right down here. This is the old North Fork of Putah Creek. That's the one that used to flood Davis. It's been blocked off, and the creek that we now visit is the South Fork of the of Putah Creek, safely dredged and levied and blocked off from the town of Davisville, and then controlled by a dam upstream. Sort of a triple whammy that really put the creek into a bad state. These are the headwaters of Putah Creek up there in Lake County, where it really has kind of different vibe, as you can see from these pictures. And these are the older pictures. This is up in Pope Valley and Monticello, this is where the reservoir is today. And here you can see Putah Creek really running along the surface. Here's a wedding party that was happening at the creek, apparently, and you can see it's right up there. There's no levees, there's no boundary really between the landscape and the creek. And by that I mean really no boundary. Not only could you go visit and have a party or a wedding, but you could also be flooded out by it. So in 1872, the creek was diverted away from Davisville, which is the South Fork, and that's what I just talked about. And then many years later, that solved some of the flooding, but not all of it. So many years later, the Army Corps of Engineers went and dredged the channel of the South Fork and built levees. And that was sure that was a great move to protect the town from flooding. But um, and like just not 10 years later, um, another decision was made to build the Monticello Dam and create Lake Berryessa. And that combination of events left the creek. There you can see Berryessa. It's pretty extensive. And there you see cold water coming out from the bottom of the dam, yada, yada, yada. This is the Putah Creek Diversion Dam, Lake Solano. Um, 95% of Putah Creek's water was now diverted down to southern part of Solano County for agriculture and urban use. So the Army Corps came in, channelized the river, dredged it, built giant levees, and then 10 years later, they diverted most of the flows out of Putah Creek. And so what was Putah Creek? The once mighty flooding Putah Creek became kind of just a little whimper of a ditch that flowed, just south of Davis. And this is what it looked like during 1987-92. Lower Pewter Creek, pretty much, this is the lower end of it out towards the bypass, but the creek basically dried up. And here it's not dried up, but it was still stagnant water that just sat there and cooked and became kind of nasty. There was nothing flowing through there during the drought years. And then parts of it would just dry up completely. And people took to like throwing their junk in it because it's just an old junky, ugly canal at this point, just an old ditch, basically like a storage system for water that didn't get to Solano County. Here you can see a dead car. Somebody just, drove over the road and they just left it. This is just back in 1996, not that long ago. And in response, you can still go there and you can still see some of this stuff. You can see old washing machines and dead cars. If you look closely, now they're all overgrown by vines and trees, so they're harder to get. But the Pewter Creek Council was formed around that time in the 90s to say, hey, this is where we live. Let's clean it up. So a big effort went into cleaning it. And then the city of Davis, the Pewter Creek Council, and the University of California sued Solano County. And they said, hey, it's not okay to divert all of our water and essentially create not just to steal a public resource from people living downstream, but to also leave sort of a hazardous condition where there's, like unhealthy water just sitting there. And they base this on Fish and Game Code section 5937. Commit that to memory for your fish biology class. California Fish and Game Code 5937 was kind of a watershed. Um, well, it became a watershed section when it was reinvoked for the purposes of this lawsuit. And it states that the owner of any dam shall allow sufficient water at all times to pass over, around, or through the dam to keep in good condition any fish that may be planted or exist below the dam. And what this basically says that every dam owner, whether you're the mighty Shasta Dam or some agricultural diversion off of the San Joaquin or in Cache Creek or in Pewter Creek, you're responsible for leaving enough water for the fishes in that creek to live. And so they maintained in this lawsuit that 5937 forced the owners of the dam, which was Solano County Water Agency, to keep the creek from drying up, but there had to be enough flows in the spring to support native fishes, that there had to be attraction flows to support salmon who might be returning to spawn on the creek in the fall, and that the flows had to be high enough to kind of flush out the non-native fishes that had invaded the area, and also high enough flows for natural processes to occur. A canal, a ditch just forms when you've got water. Either you've got way too much water going through a constrained space, or you just have like nothing going through it. And so intermediate to high variable flows help create meandering channels, that is, meandering channels that go back and forth, which slow down the water and kind of find the gravels so that you get high quality sediment and you get the mud out of there. Essentially, high flows remove some of the mud and silt and they restore the gravels, which are beneficial for aquatic insects and beneficial for larval fishes, beneficial for lamprey, juveniles that spend 2 years developing in the creek. They dig into the sediments and filter feed. Um, they create high flows, create enough clean gravels that fish like salmon can spawn successfully in it without having their eggs smothered by sediment. And so there was this theory called the natural flow regime. Um, that was developed by Leroy Poff and company here. And the natural flow regime stated that rivers had a kind of that rivers had a kind of order to the flows, to the maximum pulses that ran down it. And those flows did what I just talked about. They created certain kinds of habitat structure. They find the gravels. They supported certain kinds of fishes and food production. And that the variation in these flows throughout the year was really, really critical. And so this was in the 1980s, this sort of paradigm evolved. And so the Putah Creek folks argued successfully the lawsuit was won, and Solano County Water Agency had to provide water and along a sort of natural flow regime that was eventually essentially this was sort of applied by Peter Moyle, the fish biologist who developed this class and who categorized California fishes. He was the first person to get anyone to implement on an ecosystem scale this natural flow regime. And so in the old days, um, the um, the pulses in Putah Creek um, would be just these sorts of static occasional pulses that corresponded. This doesn't show it very well. I'm sort of sad I put this in here, but you can mostly see that when it's wet, you get these pulses. When it's very wet, you get giant pulses, and then most of the time it's kind of flat. And after the accord, the pulses each year are kind of spread out. You get a distribution of the water across the calendar year in different ways. You still don't get much in drought years, but the proponents of this argue that drought years are part of the California landscape. It's a Mediterranean climate. You're going to have drought. Most of the California fishes are reasonably well adapted to tolerate drought. So here's what they came up with, taking one of these years and exploding it here. Um, this is year one. We'll call it a wet year. This is year two. We'll call it a dry year. These folks said that the natural flow regime should have these fall pulses to to there should be attraction flows essentially in the fall, which should pull up any native fishes like salmon that would spawn on the river. And then you would expect to have high flows after January, which is the wettest time of the year. And that would keep those eggs that might be developing there, keep whatever native fishes are living there, keep them in good condition during the wet part of the year, release that water, whereas before it just been kind of flatlining. And then in the spring, another sort of release flow that would push out or help push out the developing fishes like the juvenile salmon that have emerged from the gravel. So those release flows, those spring recession flows, they're called, would help shunt them out of the system. And in a dry year, you would have the same thing too. Even though there was less water available, the attraction flows would occur around the same time, and then you'd have the winter pulse, which would be less significant, and then you'd have a series of other pulses depending on how many storms there were, and then you'd have the final spring recession flows to push things out there. And then in the summer, you'd have very little water in the creek, and that pattern worked really well, especially with anadromous fishes that would leave the creek. But then there were a lot of native fishes that were just adapted to handle those hot, dry conditions, and a lot of non-native fishes that we thought, well, they wouldn't make it, and that would be okay. And it turns out that it worked. It was really successful. Here's a quick look at some of the fishes that we find in Putah Creek. This is a pike minnow. Here's a largemouth bass. That's an introduced fish. Um, is that a hardhead? I can't tell if that's a hardhead or if that's I think it's a hardhead. Here's another pike minnow. This is actually a split tail. This is actually what a terrible slide. There's a whole bunch of fish that don't actually split tail are mostly from uh, they're split tail occasionally come up, but they're really, really rare. This is a tule perch. Here's a pike minnow. Sorry, gang. I guess I didn't finish my slideshow before I started. Apologies. Anyway, this is where I really wanted to get. I'll take that slide out. Um, Before the Putah Creek Accord was implemented, there were a lot more aliens than natives. After the implementation, we got a lot more natives. The one thing I kind of should show you from the slide that does make sense is that there was a mix, and there still is a mix of both alien fishes, like the shiner here, like the largemouth bass, and native fishes like a split-tailed tule perch, hardhead, and a pike minnow. Um, there's a diversity of fishes. It's a novel ecosystem, and it's going to have the aliens. They're not going anywhere. They're part of the fabric of the landscape. But using dam releases, we're able to control just the proportion of native fishes relative to the invasives because we're not looking at a ditch anymore. Success. We're looking at a sort of more functional system. So since 2013, salmon have started returning up Putah Creek, and they've been increasing every year. 2015, 2017, there were more than 500. And in 2018, 34,000 out migrating juveniles in the screw trap. And this year, we're expecting about 1,000 fishes, 1,000 salmon to come back up into the creek. And some of these are actually locally spawned. So, the question was for folks, okay, so the salmon come up the creek. Are these just stray fishes? Are they hatchery fish that were born somewhere else and they were released and they went out to sea and now they're just wandering around trying to find their way home? They don't really know where the hatchery is. They're not very smart. Did they just wander up into Putah Creek accidentally? Well, the paper that I assigned for you this week by Lauren Hitt demonstrates that there certainly are a number of hatchery strays. Like it's dominated by hatchery strays in purple here. This is across different years up to 2021. But she also shows that there's an increasing number of local Putah Creek fishes that are recurring or returning, and that's the yellow here that you see. And that suggests that a native, endemic, local spawned source of fishes is developing at Putah Creek that's returning every year, which is indeed a really amazing success story. And this is Peter Moyle, the guy who kind of thought this up. This is Rich Maravich, was the original Putah Creek stream keeper. The restoration effort was pretty massive. There were students, landowners, the Putah Creek Council, people in Davis were just into it and helping out. And they cleaned up the creek, they restored it, they planted a lot of plants, they did the flow regime, they changed the morphology of the creek to flow in different patterns. And the creek you see today looks very, very different than the creek that I guess I saw in 2007 when I moved here. It was kind of a bleak place still. And in the intervening 20 years, it's become like one of my favorite places to hang out. This is a screw trap that goes in every year to. This is kind of one of those resources that Lauren Hitt used to figure out who was spawning in the creek and what their parentage was. They would catch the out migrating juveniles in the screw trap, and they take a little genetic sample of them, and they compare that with the genetics of the fishes that were moving upstream, and that's how they could tell whether there were fish that were spawning locally. These folks here are standing up. They're not just macho, they're actually standing up because they're doing a red survey, looking for the nests of salmon that spawned in the creek. And this is just a picture of Putah Creek field trip, what we're going to be doing on Saturday. People making out with fishes and stuff like that. There's still a lot of non-native fishes, like I said before. And here I go through some of the average catch that we get. These are bluegill. They're an invasive fish, um, but they're very predominant all throughout California. Here's a largemouth bass. There are goldfish in there, not many. This is a Sacramento pike minnow that I showed in the other. This is a native fish, beautiful native fish. We'll undoubtedly get a few down there. Tule perch, one of my favorites. Here's a prickly sculpin, another favorite. Western mosquito fish live everywhere because they're planted by vector controlled to eat mosquitoes. This is a big scale log perch, which is actually a really cool little fish. Somebody's doing it for their wiki fish um, that we find. It's an introduced fish. They're everywhere. They're pretty benign. And as you can see, the kind of mean catch of Putah Creek fishes from 2014, 2018. Plenty of invasive fishes, but also plenty of not introduced fishes as well. And that's what we're shooting for is a little bit of diversity in the creek. So we say it's a novel ecosystem. It means it's irreversibly altered. Like you're not gonna transform the creek back into those black and white photos from the late 1800s or early 1900s where the creek was flowing even with the landscape. Like that's not going to happen for a very, very, very long time. And we're not going to get rid of, so it's always going to kind of be channelized between the two levees that were put there by the Army Corps. But within those two levees, they've created a lot of wiggle room for the creek to meander and behave like a real creek, powered by flows from Lake Berryessa, extra water from Solano County. There's a mixture of native and non-native species, and it's not a pristine creek at all. Like humans are part of it. They're down there, they're walking, they're swimming in the creek, they're harvesting blackberries, they're fishing for fish because the water is clean and the fish are good to eat. They're down there walking their dogs and letting their dogs poop all over everywhere, which is a problem that I have with dog owners in general. People just walk down and they think, well, it's just natural. Well, yes, it is a novel ecosystem, but that's not probably the best of the features we can bring in for it. So the point is that humans are part of the ecosystem and we make decisions around how we use these resources in a novel ecosystem. And if we're progressive and thoughtful and have a big enough tent, we can make decisions that have desirable outcomes, not just for um, power and money, but for pleasure and for beauty and for other species as well. I'm running out of gas, but I want to tell you a little bit about the theory of novel ecosystems before I wrap up. I'm sure you're running out of gas, but I'm going to ask a question of this because it's kind of my thing. Novel ecosystems are driven from this paper by Hobbes in 2009. And Hobbes has this sort of conceptual model where he shows that, well, first he acknowledges the human footprint. It's pretty extensive. Wherever there's a lot of humans, there's a lot of activity, particularly towards the low temperate latitudes. Um, and his idea is that if you took two axes on a plot here, and the bottom axis is abiotic conditions, that is physical conditions, and the vertical axis would be biotic conditions. And the historical abiotic conditions and biotic conditions are down here at the origin. And as you go out, you get to a more altered condition. So you've got the abiotic, more altered, the biotic, more altered. The historical landscape, the historical ecosystem um, would have been what it is. It's a more of a historic condition. But as you disturb things more and more in both directions, as you disturb the abiotic conditions, you tend to get biotic invasives or transformations in the landscape, which leads to kind of a hybrid system. And the hybrid system is kind of reversible. Like here you can see in the purple, like restoration to an historic system is somewhat feasible. So if you introduced a few species like largemouth bass to a lake or a pond, you might be able to reverse it and return it back to the historic state where the native fishes aren't being suppressed by a massive predator. But when you start altering abiotic conditions to the point where it's really hard, so abiotic conditions invite non-native species and give those non-native species new habitats, and sometimes that's self-reinforcing. And so he said, when you get to that point where your abiotic conditions are so far gone that it's really hard to reverse them, especially combined with the invasives, the new species that have invaded, it makes it really hard to go back. And so, um, if you're in one axis where this condition was changed, it might be difficult, but you might be able to restore. If you're in just biotic, if they're just invasives, you might be able to restore, but it's that double whammy. It's that synergistic combination um, of both physical and abiotic or the biotic together. When they've gone too far, it just makes restoration, classical restoration is just difficult or usually impossible. And those are the systems I study, actually. I'll give you an example here that may help clarify. This is from that same paper. So part of it's cut off here, but here's the historical state. Here's the altered state. Historical state was some kind of a eucalyptus forest. And abiotic conditions were transformed when the water table was overdrawn, which led to a salinization of the soils. And that led to some of the native eucalyptus really being stressed out. And on top of that, stress, an invasive grass started occurring in the landscape. And once that invasive grass occurred, um, it was changing the chemical composition of the soil. And so it increased the salinization and it was releasing some kind of allelotoxin that suppressed other things. So these trees started to die out. You can see here, trees are dying out. And so there was sort of first, there was the drop of the water table, which led to the salty soils, which invited in this invasive plant. The invasive plant tended to kill off or further stress out the trees that had lived there. So the trees eventually vanished from the landscape. And all you have left is no trees on the landscape, a very arid, dry, burdened landscape with these grasses and invasive shrubs from somewhere else on the planet. And these are Australian forests, by the way. And he said, there is no way you're going to go back. You could plant as many native trees as you want on this landscape, but you're not going to have a forest. They're not going to make it. And you could raise the water table if you had the water, and you could, improve the habitat that way. But the soil itself has actually changed. And so even if you had the water, your probability of success because of these invasive species, the change in the content of the soil, and the fact that these invasives are really aggressive plants, he said, you're not going to be able to get rid of these invasives. They are just too well established. And you're going to really struggle even to change the character of the land, at least for a very, very, very long time. I mean, it's impossible to say forever because forever is a super long time, but over time things will change. As I went on at length in some of my earlier lectures, time is long. But but for our lifespan, or maybe a couple generations out, these are novel ecosystems. And they're difficult to restore, but they're not impossible to use. They're not impossible to modify in ways that nonetheless make constructive habitats. And so we argue the Putah Creek is a novel ecosystem, but it's not a barren landscape. It has a mixture of fishes and organisms, plants, and otherwise that we value and cherish, and it's a usable working landscape. And this is just kind of a theoretical idea of like this idea, like in the past, there was some sort of, this is energy. Here's time on the y-axis, on the x-axis. Energy is on the y-axis. And around the early part of the century, of the 20th century, we could imagine like this ball being sort of on a roller coaster of energy here. And we had to put a lot of energy to change the condition of the habitat. But once we changed the condition of the habitat, we pushed it over this hill of energy. It went down into a valley, and it's now very hard to return it back because the valley of energy, it's gotten to a lower energy state that just um, makes restoration impossible. But with a novel ecosystem perspective, we can imagine a future that's not perfect restoration, but rather an imperfect novel ecosystem that may nonetheless be functional. And so this has led to this idea of reconciliation landscape, reconciliation ecology, that we're reconciling ourselves to the landscape as human conservators in a new way. It's this idea of inventing and establishing and maintaining new and novel habitats that maintain some species diversity in places where people live and work and do their thing, and not expecting or letting go of the expectations that we're going to restore it to a novel system. And honestly, I got to tell you, in a system where the climate is changing on a global scale because of warming, um, everything suddenly becomes a novel ecosystem. We're no longer going to get it perfect. There are global scale systems that are in play now. And so our job as humans and care about the environment is to work with processes that can help um, focus natural processes that occur and support desirable biota in this like globally changed landscape. And so I leave you with these ideas here, and something to chew on, something I'll ask you about later probably is like, give me some other examples that you know of novel ecosystems. I've talked at length about a couple here. Um, and chew on why the idea of reconciliation ecology might be controversial to some people. Like, what kinds of objections would people have to that? It's worth thinking about. And I'll leave you with that thought. Um, and I will see you on um, Wednesday. I should be able to limp back in and we'll hang out with Carson Jeffries. And then I'll see you on Friday as well. All right. Thanks, everyone. I hope that was reasonably coherent, um, and informative to you. And I'm sorry if it wasn't, but that's all I got today. All right. Goodbye.